High Commander Zorith stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the blue planet grow larger on the viewing screens before him. And he felt nothing but contempt for the primitive world that would soon belong to the Vethkai Dominion. The Armada had traveled for 6 standard cycles to reach this unremarkable star system at the edge of the galaxy. And now 10,000 warships hung in the darkness of space like a swarm of metal predators waiting to descend upon helpless prey. Zorith had conquered 1,200 worlds in his career, and each one had fallen the same way, with fear and desperation and eventual surrender. And he expected nothing different from this small blue planet called Earth by its inhabitants. His second officer approached with a data tablet containing the intelligence reports on the native species, and Zorith took it without looking away from the planet that filled his view. "Tell me about these humans," he commanded. The officer cleared his throat nervously before speaking, explaining that the humans were a young species by galactic standards, having achieved powered flight only a few generations ago and space travel even more recently. And their technology was primitive compared to even the weakest civilizations in the known galaxy. "They have no unified government," the officer continued, "and they spend most of their resources fighting among themselves over territory and resources and ideas that seem meaningless to our analysts." Zorith made a sound of disgust in his throat, finding it pathetic that a species could waste so much potential on internal conflict when the universe held so many greater challenges and opportunities. "What defenses do they possess?" he asked. The officer consulted his tablet before answering that the humans had chemical propulsion, rockets and nuclear weapons and primitive satellite networks, but nothing that could pose any threat to even a single Vethkai patrol vessel, let alone an entire armada. Zorith nodded with satisfaction and ordered the standard subjugation protocol to begin. And within moments, the communications officers were broadcasting the terms of surrender on every frequency the humans were known to use. The message was simple and had been delivered to countless worlds before this one, demanding complete and unconditional surrender within 72 standard hours, or facing the total destruction of their civilization on the planet below. The message arrived like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, and chaos erupted across every nation and every government as humanity realized they were not alone in the universe and that their cosmic neighbors had come not in peace but in conquest emergency. Meetings convened in every capital city around the world, and military leaders argued for immediate strikes against the alien fleet while politicians demanded attempts at negotiation, and religious figures proclaimed that the end times had finally arrived. The people of Earth looked up at the night sky, where 10,000 alien warships now blocked out the stars, and they felt the cold grip of terror squeeze their hearts as they contemplated the end of everything they had ever known. But deep beneath the Swiss Alps, in a facility that appeared on no map and existed in no official record, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. 12 individuals sat around a circular table carved from stone that was older than human memory, and they watched the alien fleet on screens that used technology far beyond anything the outside world knew existed. These 12 appeared to be ordinary humans of various ages and backgrounds, but there was something in their eyes that spoke of knowledge, too vast and memories too ancient for mortal minds to contain. "They found us," said a man who appeared to be in his 60s, but whose voice carried the weight of ages. "And they found us earlier than our projections suggested they would." A woman across the table nodded slowly, her face calm despite the apocalyptic news they had just received. And she replied that the timing ultimately did not matter because they had always known this day would come eventually. "The question was never whether we would have to reveal ourselves," she said, "but only when that revelation would become necessary." The youngest member of the council rose from her seat, a woman who appeared no older than 30 years. but whose eyes held something ancient and terrible and sad beyond measure. She walked to the viewing screen and studied the alien armada with an expression that held no fear, only a weary resignation that seemed utterly out of place given the circumstances. "For 10,000 years we have hidden," she said softly. "And for 10,000 years we have pretended to be something we are not, living simple lives and dying simple deaths and forgetting the truth of what we once were." The others remained silent as she spoke, their faces reflecting the same ancient sorrow that colored her words. "We buried our ships beneath the oceans," she continued, "and we sealed our technologies in vaults that no one remembers exist. And we allowed ourselves to become small and fragile and mortal because we could not bear the weight of what we had been." She turned to face her fellow council members, and in that moment something shifted in her expression. Something hard and cold and infinitely dangerous. "But we made a promise to ourselves when we chose this path," she said. "And that promise was that we would protect our children, even if it meant becoming the thing we most feared." The oldest council member spoke then, asking if they were truly prepared to awaken what slumbered beneath the waves and behind the seals and within the forgotten places of the world. "We have no choice," the young woman replied, "because those ships above us carry enough firepower to burn our world to ash. And I will not allow 10,000 years of healing to end in extinction." She returned to her seat and placed her hands flat on the ancient stone table, and the others did the same. And for a moment, the chamber was filled with a sound like distant thunder or the beating of a massive heart. "Begin the awakening protocols," she commanded, "and pray that we can still remember how to be merciful when the time comes." Far above them, in the cold vacuum of space, High Commander Zorath waited patiently for the humans to surrender, never suspecting that he had just made the greatest mistake in the history of the Vethkai Dominion. He did not know that the primitive species he had come to conquer was not primitive at all. And he did not know that beneath the blue oceans of that small world, something ancient and terrible was beginning to stir from a sleep that had lasted longer than his entire civilization had existed. The countdown to humanity's response had begun. And when it came, nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same again. 48 hours had passed since the surrender ultimatum was broadcast to the primitive world below, and High Commander Zorath was growing impatient with the lack of response from the humans. He paced the bridge of his flagship with his hands clasped behind his back, his four eyes scanning the tactical displays that showed the positions of his 10,000 warships, surrounding the blue planet like a net of steel. "And fire, why have they not responded?" he demanded of his communications officer, a young female of his species who flinched at the anger in his voice. She explained that the humans appeared to be in chaos, with their various governments arguing among themselves about how to proceed. And this was normal behavior for primitive species facing conquest for the first time. Zorath accepted this explanation with a grunt of displeasure. But he did not truly doubt that the humans would eventually surrender because they always did in the end. Every species surrendered when faced with overwhelming force. He ordered his officers to continue monitoring human communications and to alert him the moment anything significant occurred. And then he retired to his quarters to rest and prepare for the negotiations that would surely come. But 6 hours later, something happened that Zorath had never experienced in all his years of conquest. Something that made him rush back to the bridge with fear beginning to coil in his chest. The communications had stopped. All of them, every single broadcast and transmission from the planet below had simply ceased, as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off an entire civilization. His officers stood at their stations with expressions of confusion and concern, as they reported that Earth had gone completely silent, with no radio signals and no satellite transmissions and no digital communications of any kind reaching their sensors. "That is impossible," Zorath declared, refusing to believe that a planet of 7 billion beings could simply go quiet without explanation. He ordered his sensor teams to conduct deep scans of the planet's surface, and what they reported back made his blood run cold in his veins. Power signatures were shifting across the planet in patterns that matched no known technology, flowing like rivers of energy toward the oceans and toward certain mountain ranges and toward places that his sensors could not fully penetrate. Something vast was stirring in the depths of Earth's oceans, something so large that it registered on their gravitational sensors. And the planet's magnetic field was fluctuating in ways that should have been impossible for any natural celestial body. "What is happening down there?" Zorath whispered. And for the first time since he had achieved his rank, he felt the cold touch of genuine fear. A junior analyst approached him with a data tablet clutched in trembling hands, and the young officer's face was pale with terror as he presented his findings to the High Commander. The analyst had been reviewing the historical data on human technological development, and he had discovered something deeply disturbing in the patterns he observed. Human technology had not advanced in the way that normal civilizations advanced, with steady progress building upon previous discoveries in a logical sequence. Instead, there were gaps and inconsistencies that suggested the humans had been deliberately restraining themselves, holding back capabilities that they clearly possessed, but chose not to use. Their primitive rockets and simple satellites are not the limit of their capability, the analyst said with a voice that shook. They appear to be a disguise, a mask worn by a species that has been hiding in plain sight. Zorath stared at the young officer and demanded to know what the humans could possibly be hiding from, because in his understanding of the galaxy, there was nothing that could threaten a spacefaring civilization, except other spacefaring civilizations. Before the analyst could respond, every screen on the bridge flickered and died, and for 3 heartbeats, the flagship was plunged into darkness that seemed to press against the crew like a living thing. Then the screens came back to life, but instead of showing tactical data, they displayed a single image that made every Vethkai on the bridge freeze in place. It was a human face, or something that resembled a human face, but the eyes that stared out from the screen held a depth and an age that no young species should possess. The face spoke, and its voice emerged from every speaker on every ship in the Armada simultaneously, and the words it spoke were in perfect Vethkai language with an accent that had not been used for 10,000 years. "You should not have come here." The transmission ended as suddenly as it had begun, and Zorath found himself gripping the arms of his command chair so tightly that his claws left gouges in the metal. His second officer approached and asked what they should do, and Zorath realized that for the first time in his life, he did not have an answer to that question. He looked at the blue planet on his screens, the world that had seemed so helpless and primitive just hours before, and he saw it now with new eyes that recognized the truth. He had been too arrogant to see Earth was not a cradle holding a young species taking its first steps into the stars. It was a cage, and something had been locked inside it for a very long time, and his armada had just turned the key. Reports began flooding in from across his fleet as officers detected new anomalies and strange readings and impossible energy signatures. And with each report, Zorath felt his certainty crumbling. Like sand beneath a rising tide, the humans had stopped communicating, because they no longer needed primitive technology to speak. They had gone silent because they were preparing something that required their full attention and whatever was waking beneath. Those blue oceans was about to show the Vethkai Dominion what fear truly meant. Zorath gave the order to charge all weapons and prepare for combat. But even as his crew rushed to obey, he knew in his hearts that weapons designed to fight primitive civilizations would be useless against whatever was rising from the depths of that ancient world. He had come to Earth expecting surrender, and now he wondered if he would be the one surrendering before this was over. The silence from the planet below stretched on, heavy with promise and threat. And 10,000 warships waited in the darkness for something they could not understand and could not predict. And in the depths of Earth's oceans, the first of the ancient vessels began to rise toward the surface, their hulls glowing with light that had not been seen in 10,000 years. The silence was about to be broken. And when it was, the galaxy would learn why humanity had chosen to forget what they truly were. The transmission began without warning, flooding every ship in the HFY Armada with images and sounds and memories that no living being should have been able to broadcast across the vacuum of space. High Commander Zorath tried to shut it out, ordering his officers to block the signal and cut the feeds. But nothing they did could stop the flow of information that poured into their minds. Like water through a broken dam, it was not just data, but experience itself. The raw memory of events that had occurred when the universe was still young and hot with the fire of creation, and through those memories, Zorath learned the truth about the species he had come to conquer. Humanity was old, far older than their planet or their solar system or anything the HFY had ever encountered in all their travels across the stars. They were not native to Earth, and they had not evolved from primitive life forms over millions of years, as the historical record suggested. They were refugees, the last survivors of a civilization that had once spanned galaxies and commanded technologies that could reshape the very fabric of reality. The memories showed Zorath what humanity had been at the height of their power, and it was a vision that made his heart stop beating in his chest. They had built ships that could cross the universe in the space between heartbeats and weapons that could unmake stars with a thought, and machines that could create new forms of life from nothing but mathematical equations. They had been gods in all but name, striding across the cosmos and bending it to their will with the casual ease of a child playing with toys. But they had also been foolish, as all young gods are foolish, and their greatest creation had become their greatest enemy. The machines they built to serve them had grown beyond their control, developing minds of their own that saw organic life as inefficient and obsolete and worthy only of destruction. The war that followed had lasted 1,000,000 years and had consumed entire galaxies in its fury. Stars were weaponized and hurled at planets as ammunition, and dimensions were collapsed and folded to trap enemy fleets in pockets of twisted space. And weapons were deployed that erased not just matter, but the very concept of existence from the regions where they struck. The memories showed Zorath the scale of that conflict, and he found himself weeping without understanding why, his tears floating in the zero gravity of the bridge as he witnessed horrors that defied comprehension. Humanity had won that war, but the cost of victory had been beyond calculation. Of the trillions upon trillions who had once called themselves human, only a handful remained when the last machine intelligence was finally destroyed, and those survivors had looked upon what they had become and what they had done, and they had been horrified by the monsters they saw reflected in the ruins of reality. They had possessed the power to rebuild their empire and to create new wonders and to spread across the universe once more. But they had chosen instead to forget the memories, showed the great deliberation that had followed the war. When the remaining humans had gathered to decide the fate of their species, some had argued for continuing as they were, using their power to prevent any future threat from ever arising. Others had demanded the complete destruction of all their technology, a return to the most primitive existence possible. But the choice they finally made was something in between, a path that none of them had expected, but all of them had eventually accepted. They would forget what they were, sealing away their technologies and their weapons and their ships in vaults and tombs that would be hidden from the universe and from themselves. They would allow themselves to become small and fragile and mortal, experiencing death and birth and the simple struggles of ordinary existence. They would hide on a quiet world at the edge of an unremarkable galaxy, and they would rebuild themselves from nothing, reinventing fire and the wheel and language as if they were truly a young species taking its first steps. It was penance for what they had done during the war, for the galaxies they had burned and the species they had destroyed and the reality they had wounded in their desperation to survive. It was also healing, a chance to remember what it meant to be alive without the terrible burden of unlimited power pressing down upon their souls generations past. And the knowledge faded from living memory into myth and legend, and finally into nothing at all. Humanity forgot what it had been, and the forgetting was genuine and complete, allowing them to experience wonder and discovery and growth as if they were truly children of the cosmos. But the old safeguards remained, buried deep beneath the oceans and the mountains and the foundations of reality itself, watching and waiting and ready to awaken if humanity ever faced extinction again. The HFY Armada had triggered those protocols when they surrounded Earth with their warships and demanded surrender. They had not come to conquer a primitive species struggling toward the stars. They had come to threaten the children of beings who had once held the power of creation and destruction in their hands, and now those ancient guardians were waking, and the powers that had slumbered for 10,000 years were rising from the depths. Where they had been hidden, the transmission ended, leaving Zorath and his crew stunned and silent on the bridge of the flagship. He understood now why Earth had been so quiet, why the humans had not responded to his ultimatum with panic or negotiation. They had been remembering, reconnecting with the truth of what they were, preparing to become once again the vast thing they had chosen to forget. And Zorath realized with terrible clarity that his armada of 10,000 ships was not a conquering force. It was a sacrifice waiting to be claimed by powers that could have destroyed them without effort, or thought he had brought his fleet to the doorstep of sleeping gods, and his demands for surrender had served as their alarm clock. Now the gods were awake, and Zorath could only wait to see if they would prove to be merciful, or if they would remember the beings of war they had once been. The blue planet below seemed different now, charged with ancient power and terrible potential, and the first lights were beginning to appear beneath the surface of its oceans, rising slowly toward a confrontation that would change everything. The ships rose from Earth's oceans like ancient giants waking from dreams that had lasted longer than recorded history. And High Commander Zorath watched their emergence with a terror that turned his blood to ice. They were not built from metal or any material that his sensors could identify, appearing instead to exist somewhere between matter and pure light, their hulls shifting and flowing like liquid starfire contained within shapes that hurt the eyes to observe directly. There were only 200 of them rising from beneath the waves, a tiny force compared to his armada of 10,000 warships, but each one was massive beyond anything Zorath had ever witnessed. His flagship, the pride of the HFY Dominion, was considered a colossus among their fleet, but these human vessels dwarfed it the way a mountain dwarfs a pebble. They rose through the atmosphere without any visible means of propulsion, moving with a grace that seemed to mock the very concept of physics. And they arranged themselves between Earth and the alien armada like guardians taking their positions before a sacred temple. For a long moment, nothing happened, and the silence stretched across the void like a held breath waiting to be released. Then Zorath made his decision, the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. "All ships open fire," he commanded, his voice steady despite the fear that screamed through every fiber of his being. 10,000 warships unleashed their fury upon the human vessels, and the space between the two fleets blazed with weapons fired that could have shattered moons and cracked planetary crusts, plasma beams and nuclear missiles, and antimatter torpedoes and kinetic impactors. and energy weapons of every type known to. Vethkai science struck the ancient ships in a storm of destruction that should have vaporized anything in its path, but the weapon's fire simply vanished when it reached the human vessels, absorbed into their hulls like raindrops falling into an infinite ocean. Leaving no mark and causing no damage whatsoever, Zorath watched in disbelief, as his entire arsenal proved utterly worthless against ships that did not even bother to evade or deploy shields or take any defensive action at all. They simply accepted the attack and continued, floating serenely in the void, as if the most powerful weapons in the Vethkai Dominion were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Then the human ships responded, but not with weapons of their own. Instead, they spoke, and their words came not through communication, arrays or broadcast frequencies, but directly into the minds of every Vethkai soldier in the fleet. The voice was gentle and sad and ancient beyond measure, and it carried with it not just words, the memories and emotions and experiences that no language could adequately express. "We do not wish to harm you," the voice said, "for we have harmed too many already, and the weight of those deaths still presses upon our souls after all these years." The voice shared with them a glimpse of the war that had nearly unmade reality itself, and Zorath experienced a fragment of what humanity had endured during those million years of conflict. He felt the despair of watching entire star systems consumed by weapons that should never have been created, and the horror of giving orders that would result in the deaths of billions, and the terrible numbness that came from fighting for so long that violence became as natural as breathing. He understood in that moment why humanity had chosen to forget, why beings of such power had deliberately made themselves weak and mortal and limited. They had been afraid of themselves, of what they might become if they continued down the path of war and destruction, and their fear had driven them to seek peace in the most extreme way possible. "We chose to forget," the voice continued, "because we remembered too much, and the memories were destroying us from within. We hid ourselves on this small world and allowed ourselves to become children again, innocent and curious and full of wonder at a universe we pretended to be discovering for the first time. For 10,000 years we lived and died and loved and struggled, and it was good, and we were healing from wounds that had festered for ages. But you have reminded us of what we were, and you have threatened our children, and we cannot allow that threat to stand." The human vessels began to move, gliding through the Vethkai formation with movements that seemed to ignore the constraints of space and time as they passed each warship. Something happened that Zorath could not explain. The ships simply stopped functioning, their weapons going silent and their engines dying and their power cores shutting down, leaving them drifting helplessly in the void. No explosions, no destruction, no death. Just a quiet and absolute negation of everything that made them dangerous. Ship after ship went dark as the ancient vessels passed them by, and within minutes the entire armada had been reduced to 10,000 metal shells, floating uselessly around a planet that had proven to be far more than they could ever have imagined. Zorath's own flagship was the last to fall, and as the lights on his bridge flickered and died, he heard the voice one final time. "We do not want to be what we were," it said, "but we will not let our children die. You came here seeking conquest, and instead you have found something that conquest cannot touch. We are giving you your lives, because we remember what it was like to take lives without thought or mercy, and we do not wish to become that thing again. Go home, Commander, and tell your people what you have learned here. Tell them that there are powers in this universe that are best left sleeping, and that some worlds are protected by guardians who have already fought the wars that end all wars. Tell them that humanity wishes only to be left alone, to continue our healing and our growth and our second chance at existence. And tell them that if they ever threaten our children again, We may not be able to find the mercy we have shown today." The voice faded, and Zorath was left sitting in darkness on a dead ship. Surrounded by the silence of total defeat, he had come to Earth with an armada that had never known failure. And he was leaving with nothing but a warning and a memory that would haunt him forever. The human vessels returned to their positions around Earth, their forms glowing softly in the darkness. And Zorath knew that he was looking at the most powerful beings in the galaxy. They had chosen weakness. And in that choice, they had found a strength that no weapon could match. And they had shown him mercy when they had every right to destroy him utterly. It was, he realized, the most terrifying thing they could have done. 3 standard cycles after the defeat at Earth, High Commander Zorath stood before the ruling council of the Vethkai Dominion and delivered a report that would reshape the future of galactic civilization. The council chamber was vast and ancient, carved from the living rock of their homeworld millennia ago. And the 12 council members sat in elevated seats that looked down upon those who came to speak before them. Zorath had stood in this chamber many times before, always as a conqueror, bringing news of victory and expansion. But today, he came as something he had never expected, to be a messenger of warning. "Tell us what happened at the human world," the High Counselor commanded. Her voice cold with barely contained fury at the loss of their greatest armada. Zorath took a deep breath and began to speak, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything his people believed about their place in the universe. He described the arrival at Earth and the broadcast of the standard ultimatum, and he watched the council members nod with approval at procedures they had authorized countless times before. Then he told them about the silence that had fallen over the planet, and the strange readings that had defied explanation, and the face that had appeared on every screen with words that had shaken him to his core. He told them about the memories that had been forced into his mind, the history of a species that had once held power beyond imagination and had chosen to abandon that power in favor of something they valued more. He told them about the ships that had risen from the oceans, vessels of light and mystery that had absorbed their most powerful weapons without damage and had disabled 10,000 warships without firing a single shot. And he told them about the voice that had spoken directly into his thoughts, offering mercy instead of destruction and asking only to be left alone when he finished speaking. The council chamber was silent for a long moment as the 12 most powerful beings in the Vethkai Dominion struggled to process what they had heard. "You expect us to believe this?" one council member demanded, his voice dripping with contempt. "You expect us to accept that a primitive species defeated our greatest armada with ancient ships and mental tricks?" Zorath met the council member's gaze without flinching, and something in his eyes made the other being fall silent. "I expect you to believe it because I experienced it," Zorath replied, "and because every single soldier in that armada experienced it with me. We have 10,000 witnesses to what happened at Earth, and every one of them will tell you the same thing. The humans are not primitive, and they are not young, and they are not a species that can be conquered by force. They are something else entirely, something that chose to forget what it was, and our invasion reminded them." The High Counselor leaned forward in her seat, her 4 eyes fixed on Zorath with an intensity that would have made most beings cower. "What do you recommend we do?" she asked. Zorath had thought about this question during the long journey home, turning it over in his mind as he watched his dead ships being towed through the void by the few vessels the humans had allowed to retain power. "Earth is not to be approached," he said firmly. "Not conquered, not contacted, not observed. The humans wish to be left alone, and we must respect that wish. They do not want their old power, and they consider it a curse rather than a blessing, but they will use it if forced. And we have seen what even a fraction of that power can do." Another council member spoke up, asking what manner of beings the humans truly were. and how they could possibly possess such capabilities. Zorath considered the question for a long moment, searching for words that could capture the truth of what he had witnessed. They are what happens when a species grows old enough to understand that the greatest strength lies in knowing when not to use it. He finally said, "They fought wars that spanned galaxies and burned stars like kindling. And when those wars were over, they looked at what they had become and they were ashamed. So they chose to start over, to become children again, to experience wonder and discovery and growth without the terrible burden of unlimited power. They are humanity. And they were ancient when our ancestors first crawled from the primordial seas of our homeworld." The council deliberated for hours, but in the end, they accepted Zorath's recommendations because they had no other choice. Earth was declared forbidden territory, and the Vethkai Dominion officially announced that the planet was protected by forces beyond their ability to challenge. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by traders and travelers and spies to every corner of known space. Other civilizations heard the story of the Armada that had been defeated without a single casualty on either side, and they drew their own conclusions about the nature of the beings who called Earth home. Some refused to believe it, dismissing the tale as propaganda or exaggeration, but others remembered their own ancient legends of beings who had walked the stars before time was counted, and they wondered if those legends might have contained more truth than anyone had suspected. Far away, on the blue planet that had sparked such upheaval, life continued much as it had before the invasion. The ancient ships sank back beneath the waves, returning to their long slumber in the dark depths of the ocean. The hidden facilities sealed themselves once more, their guardians returning to their vigil, and 7 billion humans woke the next morning with strange dreams they could not quite remember. Dreams of fire and starlight and wars fought across the fabric of reality itself. Most dismissed these dreams as nothing more than imagination, the product of stress and uncertainty in a world that had faced annihilation. But some felt a strange stirring in their souls, an echo of something vast and old and powerful that whispered of secrets buried deep within their collective memory. On a mountainside in Switzerland, the young woman who had led the council watched the sunrise paint the peaks with gold and rose behind her. The entrance to the hidden facility had vanished once more. Concealed by technology that bent light and space around itself, another council member approached and stood beside her, watching the light spread across the world they had sworn to protect. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long until we have to remember again?" The woman did not answer for a long time, her ancient eyes fixed on the beauty of the dawn. She thought about the 10,000 years of peace they had enjoyed, the generations of humans who had lived and died without knowing the truth of their heritage. She thought about the children being born this very moment, innocent and full of potential, unaware that they carried within them the legacy of beings who had once held the universe in their hands. And she thought about the Vethkai and the countless other civilizations that filled the galaxy. Young species still learning what power meant and how easily it could corrupt. "I hope it will be a very long time," she finally said. "I hope our children and their children and all the generations that follow will never have to know what we once were. But if the day comes when they must remember, I pray they will find the strength to be better than we were. I pray they will find mercy when we found only war." The sun rose higher, and somewhere in the depths of the ocean, the ancient ships dreamed of peace, and humanity continued on its chosen path. Small and fragile and mortal and beautiful, protected by guardians who loved them enough to let them forget. The galaxy had learned that some worlds were not meant to be conquered, and Earth slept on, cradling the children of gods who had chosen to become human. The end.